Many of you might already know this, but in our church, we have different seasons just as nature has different seasons. Instead of fall and winter, we celebrate Advent and then Christmas. And instead of spring and summer, we celebrate Lent and Easter and Pentecost. And the time in between these special times we refer to as ordinary time. It is said that this season, the coming of Advent, jolts the church out of ordinary time with the news that it is time to think about fresh possibilities for a new way of living and a new way of being. It's kind of church talk to refer to time to see things in a new way and to find healing and hope in our lives, even in the darkest and scariest places. It's a time of looking around for signs and indications of the new that might be ready to surprise us or fill us with awe. It's a time when we look in different directions in our lives to gain new insights or understanding. It's a time when mystery and wonder, God-filled moments break through our daily routines. It's a time that even in the dark days of winter, a light begins to shine that beckons us forward to new possibilities. And for some, it's a spiritual time to reflect and ponder. It may make us feel vulnerable. It may require us to let go of some presumptions and judgments. It may require us to let go of old ways and explore the possibility of living in new ways. Advent, preparing ourselves for new hopes and dreams. At Advent, God's people summon the courage and the spiritual strength to remember that the holy breaks into the daily and sees the chance to open our hearts to healing and life-changing grace of God. And grace I like to think of as the experience of those unexpected, unconditional, unending, loving ways of the one who created us. So Advent actually is not really a passive time, just waiting and watching, but in fact, it's actually more an active time, an opening of our lives to new possibilities and new dreams and renewed hope for all of our lives. Today's reading, read by Janet, tells the story of Christmas, the birth of Jesus. It described how Mary and Joseph were engaged to be married. It was time of shared hopes and dreams for Mary and Joseph, between their families, and even for their broader community. They all came together to celebrate this relationship that was going to move forward. But before the wedding has taken place, Mary is pregnant, and Joseph knows he's not the father. And in those days, to be a woman unwed and pregnant had consequences, in some cases, even death. There was judgment and shame to the entire family. It's not really the Christmas card vignette that we often imagine about this holy family. We have the impression that Joseph was older. Not sure how we got that impression. There's really not much said about Joseph. We really don't know if he was younger or older. We only have these 3 verses that we heard read this morning and a few other verses in Luke that describe Joseph as being from the lineage of King David. But what we do know about Joseph is that he loved this young woman, Mary. And perhaps he'd lived long enough to know that life happens and that not everything is clearly right or wrong, as some sometimes think. There were sometimes gray areas. He knew Mary to be a good woman, a woman of faith. She had shared with Joseph the message that the angel had given to her. Had it been a dream, he wondered? She spoke of an angel appearing to her. He knew from his own religious upbringing that God could speak to people, sometimes in a burning bush, in a quiet whisper, in a still, small voice, in a dream, even by an angel. So Joseph decided he would give Mary the benefit of the doubt. But quietly he would go ahead and cancel their wedding so she might avoid some of the public shame. He meant her no harm. He was an honorable man, and he would act honorably to do his best to protect Mary. He would have to put his own hopes and dreams aside for the time being. But, as sometimes happens in life, things got even a little more complicated. Joseph himself had a dream. And in that dream, the angel told Joseph to go ahead and take Mary as his wife and raise her son, Jesus. He was told that Jesus would be a special child with a purpose to bring hope and healing to a broken and despairing world. This child, whom he was to raise as his own, would be a light to shine in the darkest places in the world. Perhaps that's the way to look at this passage, as Joseph showing Mary and Jesus the kind of love that God shows all of us, even when we are not faithful, even when we are ashamed or even the world condemns us. God will not abandon us. God comes alongside us and offers to provide for us. And God leans in close and says, I will be with you always. Emmanuel, God with us. In this Christmas story, we hear more about Mary, of course, than Joseph. Joseph is often that little side character that we don't hear a lot about. Even the shepherds and angels, the barn animals, the sheep and the shepherds get more attention, even in our carols that we sing throughout Christmas. But, when you really stop and think about it, if Joseph had chosen to dismiss Mary, move to another city and start a new life without his betrothed, we may not be sitting here this morning. Joseph, the guy only mentioned in a few phrases, might have put a stop to the whole dream. If he hadn't acted faithfully, listening to the angel in his dream rather than perhaps his own dreams, we may not have been celebrating Christmas this December 2019. Joseph was an ordinary guy who did an extraordinary thing. I have a Joseph in my own life. As many of you know, I was adopted, and my birth mother had found herself unwed and pregnant with no family really around to support or help her. If her pregnancy had become known, she would likely have lost her job and then been unable to pay for her rent. And so she made the difficult decision, out of love, I believe, to put me up for adoption. Almost a year later, she met a gentleman, an honorable man. When they got serious, she knew she had to be honest with him about the child that she had relinquished. She didn't want any secrets between them. He told her he needed time to think about it. And much to her chagrin, he took 3 whole days to think about it. He could have ended things there. He could have judged her and no one would have criticized him, but he didn't. He loved her, and he wanted to stand by her. So much so that together they went back to the adoption agency to see whether or not I had been placed. I had been. And so they went on with their own lives. They got married. They had 2 daughters. And 35 years later, I met Pat and grew to know and love him as a stepdad as he grew to know and love me as another daughter. At his funeral a couple of years ago, his sister, who was 90, told me, he loved you as his own. He would have raised you as his own. An ordinary man acting in extraordinary ways. A man with hopes and dreams who acted with faith and love. A man whose heart was big enough to accept, support, and love his wife for over 50 years and her firstborn child. He was my Joseph. The news and headlines have been filled recently with many accounts of men abusing and misusing their power and privilege, particularly over women. Men who have exploited women, and men who have felt threatened by women. Especially this past December the 6th, when we remember the 14 women who were shot and killed by a man who resented their hopes and dreams to be engineers. I'm privileged to have known some honorable and respectful men. Men of faith, men who acted with courage and conviction, men who listened to their hearts, men who were not threatened by me but rather encouraged me, men who ignored the criticism or judgment of others to stand by the women of their dreams. All Joseph could do, and he vowed to do his best, was help his beloved Mary raise the child. And together they would teach him hard work and the value of honesty, And Joseph would try to show his child by the actions he took every day that love mattered the most. It wasn't just a commitment, it was a calling, God's calling, an angel's request. Hopes and dreams for men and women and children of faith. Jesus was described as the hope for the world, and he was a child born of dreams with angels speaking to Mary and Joseph to guide them. It was an ordinary time that became extraordinary. Plain folk listened to angels, wise ones followed the stars, and new hope and light came into the world. The angels and stars are still among us if we only take the time to see them and to listen for them. Our Advent time can bring us out of the ordinary to the extraordinary too. And God's hopes and dreams can come alive for us in this day, in our lives, for God is still with us. At Advent, God's people summon the courage and strength like Joseph to remember that the holy breaks into the daily and seize the chance to open our hearts to the healing and life-changing grace of God. Like Joseph, may we honor our calling to do our best to act in hope-filled and loving ways. Amen.